This is the second year of the CRR19 bike ride. I am delighted that it's being hosted in Bronzeville, which is the epicenter of Black history in Chicago.
A painful history, but it's a history that we need to know if we want to know the path forward.
Approximately 101 years ago, the worst incident of racial violence in Chicago history broke out, even though very few people know about it, let alone that it profoundly shaped the city to this day.
38 individuals killed, 25 African American and 13 whites.
On a very hot Sunday afternoon, July 27th, 1919, a group of black boys went swimming in Lake Michigan because it was hot, and that's what people do in Chicago when it's hot. A white man on the beach at 29th Street started to throw rocks at these children, policing an unofficial yet very real boundary in the waters of Lake Michigan, killing one of them, 17-year-old Eugene Williams.
Today, the reason why I'm wearing this helmet is that one way that we educate is through bike tours, by taking people to different sites so they can physically see what the space looked like. We can describe to them what happened in the past, but also build a connection, a linkage to what's going on today.
And we're meeting at 35th Street and State because 5 people were killed on the second night of the race riot, July 28th, 1919. This was nicknamed by the Chicago Defender the vortex of violence because more people were killed here than any other location.
There's history here, and going to each site that pertains to the race riot is something that needs to be learned.
I think it's so important because this is a piece of Chicago history that has been lost to us.
We're acutely aware of the impact that violence has on Chicago youth today. Given that, it's important for us to partner with Firebird Community Arts that focuses on youth that have been impacted by violence. They will be leading in the work related to creating the historical markers. One key community partner was Saida Taylor from Organic Oneness. Organic Oneness was really looking to elevate how can we focus on healing and reconciliation as connected to oppression.
So I'm excited to commemorate in a healthy way by putting on our masks and getting on our bikes and getting to meet people from the community.
We're more than Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and Harriet Tubman. We have to expound our history about the unknown heroes and sheroes that contribute to the fabric of this country. I'm so happy to be a part of this organization.
It's an opportunity for people to come together to get better understanding, to understand the history of the past, and to make changes to move forward so that we can live in harmony together.
This effort is looking to uplift, bringing awareness of the event and the processes and the role that it plays to continue segregation that goes on in Chicago and why Chicago looks like a tale of multiple cities.
Hey, beautiful people. This has been an amazing journey, and I love this group so much. I want to thank you all for your contributions, vision, efforts, your thoughts, your love, your support, your guidance to make all of this happen. There is a dire need and urgency for us to understand that we are one human family, and we are witnessing the danger of believing we are not interconnected.
We are out here, organic oneness, with other community organizations, residents, beautifying Bronzeville.
This is amazing. We just believe that we as one could do whatever it takes to make our communities and our world better.
Hey, here we are at
Academy for Global Citizenship.
Yes, and we are painting murals as a way of healing.
One way that we educate is through bike tours, by taking people to different sites so they can physically see what the space looked like. We can describe what happened in the past, but also build a connection, a linkage to what's going on today.
Look at what we've done. Isn't it so amazing? Everything that we've put together has been a thought in one of our minds, and we made it a reality. I can't even imagine what we have in store next year and decades to come.
The stories we choose to tell are important. It tells a story, it tells what's important to our community. It fills me with great pride to see so many different people from different walks of life here to celebrate our storied past here in Bronzeville.
We are here at the 3rd annual CRR19 bike tour. The bike tour is a commemoration. It's a historical opportunity to learn about the history of Bronzeville.
The truth is that as important as 1919 was for the shape of the city, it is one of the main reasons that the city is as deeply segregated by neighborhood as it still is today. 38 markers for the 38 people killed, and each one located at the place where that person was killed in 1919.
We have a great opportunity to make art, we have a great opportunity to learn about history, and we have a great opportunity to move forward so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past in the city.
You know, in this moment of time, we're particularly focused on our history as African Americans, as Chicagoans, as Americans, and honoring those who lost their lives 100 years ago in these brutal attacks on the African American communities is appropriate, and I'm grateful to the folks who are sharing this history with the broader community.
With Organic Oneness, we promote the interconnectedness of all people on the earth. And the reason that this event is really important is because we're doing exactly that. We're showing what does violence bring and what does peace bring. And we need to learn the harmful effects of violence so that we don't repeat that. Because when we're hurting other people, we're hurting ourselves. And when we're all hurting, we can't advance as society.
We're all about not only riding for enjoyment, but we also want to promote safety.
I believe education is the great equalizer. Our young people need talented individuals, talented teachers who are going to inspire and motivate them. And what better place to do that in Bronzeville?
It's also understanding that we need education equity. One of the reasons why we're standing here today is because of strong partnerships with our schools in Bronzeville.
I want to welcome y'all to the greatest community in the world, Bronzeville. Come on here. It gives us the roadmap to fight for economic equity in all 77 communities of Chicago.
This is such a wonderful event. I just want to thank all of the organizers. It was a great ride today.
I'm just so glad it's happening. I'm so glad to see all the people that came out. We appreciate the love and support, and Chicago is strong. Bronzeville is resilient.
You can never appreciate where you're going until you take time to reflect on where you came from.
I used to draw, so like I didn't know it was a glass studio in back of my high school. So my teacher told me to go back there. All she did was like drop some glass on the ground, and like I just fell in love. Just never stopped doing it after that. And I started teaching classes like the first year I started doing it, because she told me like if you're teaching somebody else, you're teaching yourself. You need that arm. If you're not good at talking, you can speak through your art. So that's where we like relieve our pain at in the art studio when we make our art. So when we go into like what we call a self group, that's where we have our time to actually talk about the things that we go through. Like 2 days ago, I got into an altercation and this guy pulled a gun out on me. So it's like stuff like that that we can share with each other, and we feel comfortable to talk to each other about that type of stuff. There's 2,500 degrees, it's very hot. But as soon as I like make a vase or something like that, they're ready to jump in. Because I always put it to them, it's like, you're risking your life outside, why not risk your life doing something positive, you know? You can do it by yourself, but it's definitely a team effort. And you gotta have trust in the people that's around you. And the great thing about it, it'll be like two kids from two different neighborhoods that's like rivalry. But once they come in here and they like find out who each other is, it saves lives. But it's really for us to hang out, have fun, and we ain't gotta worry about the drama that goes on outside.
I've seen the young people in our programs come into the studio in all sorts of states after navigating their lives that day. And they sit down at the bench or the torch or the pottery wheel and they're transformed. You can see it in their body language. Someone can come in real distress and then they're laughing with their friends or dancing to the music, or even just sitting calmly, just allowing themselves to be in that moment. Part of it is knowing they're in a safe space, surrounded by people who they trust and who they know care about them. Part of it is just getting lost in the material and having an outlet for expressing thoughts that are sometimes too hard to voice. Focusing our mission to having a trauma-informed approach to art making has been a revelation. It's given us all a new lease on life, a way of moving through the world and all our activity with empathy, by meeting people where they're at. It has changed the way we operate. In this spirit, we have adopted a new identity, which needed a new name. We chose the Firebird to represent our rebirth through fire to overcome and regenerate. We use fire-based art forms, glass and ceramics, to reimagine and rebuild ourselves.
The reason why we're here today, again, is to confront this history, and this history is not tied to just riots. The riot term is actually a term that was used over 100 years ago that was actually a reflection of violence that was directed towards black people. It was directed to constrain the way blacks moved socially and where they lived. And that we understand that the trauma that many of our residents were facing were not only tied to interpersonal trauma, but also tied to structural trauma. And it was one of the work groups that was focused on education equity, the Greater Bronzeville Community Action Council, thanks to Alicia Bunton, brought in a historian who talked about how he was motivated by how Germany was confronting a difficult past, and how in the United States, we tend to operate where omission leads to healing, and we know that that's not true. Professor Peter Cole was motivated by walking down the street and would see a brass marker that in German is Stolpersteine, which means stumbling stone, and it was the last known resident of a victim of the Holocaust. And immediately, for me as a South Sider, someone that went to elementary school in Bronzeville, someone who's currently working in Bronzeville, I knew about the strengths of the community. I knew about when I walked around 40th Street, I would see beautiful murals that used to be on the old CTA branch line that went to Kenwood and also went to the stockyards. And I would see some of our histories on the murals, so I understood the importance of public art and how public art engaged individuals, especially individuals that might not be looking to be engaged. But the actual force, this organizing strength, actually came from organic oneness and Saida. Give it up for Saida, give it up for Elizabeth, Selene.
To both uplift, commemorate, educate yourselves about this history. It will make us a stronger and better Chicago.
You have to reclaim the present. We want to have conversations about the past, but we want to talk about how they impact us today. And then ultimately we have to look forward. We want to reimagine the future. What do we want our world, our community, our city to look like?
Today we see people leaving countries that are the places where they were born and have lived because there's a threat of violence so great that they can't stay. It's just not rational to stay. That's what happened in America.
From 1882 to 1910, more than 3,700 lynchings concentrated in the South occurred across the United States. Around 2/3 of lynching victims were Black, and the white people lynched were often those who helped Black victims or fought against lynching. African Americans were also restricted politically and economically, with literacy tests that could determine enfranchisement and a system called sharecropping that replaced the plantation system with a new system of bondage, tying poor Black farmers to the lands of whites. Such intense racial oppression and violence in the South initiated the Great Migration of African Americans to northern and western cities. The violence established the need for a new frontier, but as African Americans arrived in cities like Chicago, it was evident that escaping the South did not necessarily mean escaping the oppression that it embodied. The new frontier established Chicago as a hotspot for racial violence, ultimately sending on its long journey towards healing and justice. Between 1910 and 1970, around 6 million Black Americans migrated towards northern and western cities from the South. The majority of Chicago-bound migrants came from Mississippi, which had been a center of the violence that festered in the Jim Crow South. But as it turned out, it was not as easy as the masses had hoped to escape such cruelty. Instead, the mistreatment followed them like ghosts to Chicago, which they had hoped to have been able to call home. By the end of the 20th century, these migrants made up a third of the city's residents. Soon, there were more Black folks living in Chicago than in the entire state of Mississippi. At that time, many migrants did not put a label on the course of their lives. However, those millions of people and what they did would seep into nearly every realm of American life and culture. Before World War I, factories in the North had been relying greatly on European immigrants for their labor force. But when World War I began, these immigrants stopped arriving. Many men in the North also left their jobs to fight in the war. The shortage of labor ultimately opened the door for a wave of Southern African American migrants to come fill these jobs. They quickly emerged as a cheap workforce that would often act as strikebreakers, making the social complaints of European immigrants futile. The extensive social and economic tensions in Chicago set the stage for the event that would ultimately trigger its Red Summer. On July 27, 1919, thousands took to the shores of Lake Michigan seeking relief from the blazing heat of the Chicago summer sun. The beaches were segregated not by law, but simply by custom that was enforced by white people and police alike. Meanwhile, 5 Black teenagers were enjoying the water on a raft when they accidentally floated over this invisible line of segregation. A white man on the shore, George Stauber, began throwing rocks at the boys. One of the teens, Eugene Williams, was hit in the head with the rock and drowned. In no time, nearly 1,000 Black Chicagoans had assembled at the 29th Street beach to demand the arrest of Stauber for murder. But Daniel Callahan, the white police officer on duty, refused to arrest Stauber. Following the crowd's arrivals to the 29th Street beach, a Black man named James Crawford opened fire on a group of police officers, who immediately shot and killed him. The crowd, however, did not disperse. By nightfall, rumors of race war in white neighborhoods were running rampant. Soon, the violence that started on the shores of Lake Michigan had spread through the residential areas of Chicago's Black Belt. Within 24 hours, groups of young white men climbed into cars and raced through major streets, shooting at homes and businesses, while others marched up 35th Street with guns, sticks, and rocks, assaulting any Black person to cross their path. When the riots began, Juanita Mitchell had just come to Chicago with her family. Even at 107 years old, Mitchell recalled the terror of her 8-year-old self.
I can hear my uncle saying, "Here they come." And when he said, "Here they come," it meant the white folks were coming.
After rumors had spread by word of mouth, they began to spread also through sensationalized newspaper accounts. Even the highly regarded Chicago Daily News sacrificed facts for headlines that would attract attention and business. In addition to this over-dramatization by newspapers, the lack of legal aid from police demonstrated by the murder of Eugene Williams continued throughout the riots that followed. During the first few hours of the violence, 2,800 officers out of 3,500 total were deployed along the edges of the Black Belt, forming a cordon. The police claimed that they were separating the antagonists, but their strategy left few officers to patrol the rest of the city. The officers proved that they were more committed to keeping black folks in than keeping white assailants out, as the Black Belt became the center of crime and violence in Chicago. In the end, only 47 people were indicted for the racial violence that they committed, and although they made up 2/3 of the over 500 recorded casualties, blacks were indicted at double the rate of whites. The president of the time, Woodrow Wilson, also seemed to brush the widespread race riots under the rug, arguing that to stop them was a job for local authorities only. Finally, after a week of no response from both the federal and state governments, the state militia, partnered with a heavy rainstorm in Chicago, put an end to the riots on August 3rd. At this point, nearly 1,000 black homes had been burned, $250,000 worth of property had been destroyed, 500 people, mostly black, had been injured, and 38 people, 23 of whom were black, had been killed. The coroner's report on the riot described the events as having filled thousands with fear, blemished the city, and left in its wake fear and apprehension for the future. Blacks in turn responded with force, making a clear statement that African Americans would no longer be passive victims. Since then, a century of African American activism has challenged the racism and social hypocrisy that allowed those responsible for Eugene Williams' death to elude justice. Such a rise in activism allowed the NAACP to gain about 100,000 members in 1919 alone. Soon, black folks were going to Congress, petitioning for anti-lynching legislation, fighting back in the courts, and filing lawsuits when people were being mistreated. However, the significance of the Red Summer was quickly lost.
Separate from the legacy in terms of how the riots actually impact the city, right? People just don't remember it, and those with power have a disproportionate responsibility to either lead or sort of try to sort of obscure, and those with power in the 1920s didn't have any incentive to try to sort of celebrate or remember this history.
Following the Red Summer, backlash was on stark display in Chicago.
There was legal, subtle, non-overtly violent ways to achieve the same ends, which is to contain African Americans to certain parts of the city. Sure enough, residential segregation was sort of then perpetuated in other ways. Instead of using gang violence, restrictive covenants and other legal tools basically prohibited black people from moving to whole parts of the city.
Only in 1940 did the Supreme Court rule that a man named Carl Hansberry couldn't be bound by a neighborhood's restrictive covenant he hadn't signed. Meanwhile, protests throughout the 1940s and 50s sought to break down racial barriers in housing, public accommodations, and recreational activities. But the legacy of racial violence also continued throughout the 1950s with the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in 1955. Till's family had moved to Chicago during the Great Migration, but was visiting family in Mississippi when Till was kidnapped and murdered for supposedly whistling at a white woman in a store.
If the FBI would investigate, then probably then we could integrate. Yeah! Keep your eyes on the prize.
1966, famously, Martin Luther King Jr. and his family moved into a West Side neighborhood and lived off and on for the better part of half a year to raise awareness about residential segregation in non-Southern cities in what was called the Chicago Freedom Movement.
Racial tensions and divisions were still so present in Chicago at this time that King once said, "I think the people from Mississippi ought to come to Chicago to learn how to hate." By 1970, Census Data certified Chicago as a hyper-segregated municipality, a designation it would retain until the start of the new millennium. To this day, the city of Chicago remains notoriously segregated. But in 2008, Barack Obama lived at 5046 South Greenwood Ave in Kenwood, where had it not been for the battles fought by Hansberry and others, he would have been barred under the Chicago Real Estate Board's restrictive covenant, despite recently being elected President of the United States of America.